All right, welcome back from vendor break. I hope you all had time to visit some of our tables and have some cookies, and there's actually milk. Make you fall asleep, maybe not. Maybe you need coffee now if you had milk. Okay, so I now get to introduce you to Lauren Harris and Felicia Hoshino, who have worked with us for 3 years now on producing A Place for Harvest, which you see on the screens. And I had a copy and forgot to walk up with it. This book was just released this week, and we have been on a kind of a road show book release adventure in the Black Hills, and this morning at Riggs High School here in Pierre, and it's been just so much fun to bring the story of Kenny Higashi to everyone. So now it's your turn to get to learn about Kenny Higashi. Lauren Harris is the author also of Plum Neighbor, and she will tell you some about that as well. She's a journalist and a former elementary school teacher in Spearfish. She has made telling the story of the 100th/442nd Battalion her mission over the past few years, and it's a mission that I hope she is able to continue and succeed in. Felicia Hoshino is an award-winning artist and illustrator of many books, including A Place Where Sunflowers Grow, and I encourage you to look that one up. Her family was interred at the Minidoka and Poston camps, and 2 great-uncles served in the Army during World War II. Felicia is the illustrator of A Place for Harvest. They will be signing copies of A Place for Harvest tonight at the reception, and you can purchase copies here, or you can purchase copies at the reception hall. Thank you, and without further ado, let's help me welcome Felicia. Nope, Lauren starts first. Lauren Harris.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm excited to share this with you all today, and I hope to take you on a bit of the amazing journey that I've been on, learning more about this inspiring American story of history of kindness and determination in our history that's centered on a small town in South Dakota. I'll start with a little bit about me. I grew up in a military family, and we traveled quite a lot. And through our travels, we visited many important historical sites in the United States along the way. I love to read just about every book that I could find, and I gravitated toward books about history. I was just very interested in that. And this combination created in me kind of a deep interest in people, the past actions of people, where events took place and why people did what they did, and who was standing in this very spot that I'm standing, and what were they like and why were they there. I also love to teach, so I became an elementary school teacher, and what do you think we spent a lot of time on in class? History. And my husband and I homeschooled our 3 children. We studied a lot of history, and we read history-based books and tried to connect these facts with places that we lived in throughout the U.S. And one of the ways we know about history is because people wrote about it. So I decided to pursue writing, which I already loved to do as a creative outlet. At this time, we lived in Spearfish up in the Black Hills. And so I wrote for several years as a correspondent for the Rapid City Journal and doing some local periodicals. And through this experience, I interviewed many ordinary people. They seemed to be ordinary, but they were doing extraordinary things. And maybe their actions wouldn't make the history books, but what they did meant a great deal to those people around them. And I loved sharing these unknown stories with people. And I realized that our world is really filled with these folks that are seemingly ordinary, doing extraordinary things in their communities. And also that many of these things will never be recorded, and someday will never be even remembered by anyone. And one of those stories came to my mind at this time. It was one that my mother-in-law had told me that came from her family. It was an incredible tale about her grandparents that lived in Los Angeles at the turn of the 20th century and their beloved Japanese-American neighbors, and the events that surrounded the internment order for Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor. So I decided to write that down as it was passed through my family. And the sons of both of these families were U.S. Army soldiers during World War II, and the climax of the story centered around the two of them in battle far away from their home there in Los Angeles. So I thought I'd be clever and research which units these guys were in. So I easily found my mother-in-law's uncle, and then I turned to his Japanese-American friend. And I couldn't believe what I found. I loved history. I felt like I was kind of a history buff, and yet I had never heard about this unit that I discovered of all first-generation Japanese-Americans called Nisei during World War II. They were the 100th 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and they were nicknamed the Purple Heart Battalion for their heroic actions that some say turned the tide of the war in Europe. Their medal counts were stunning. They suffered some of the highest casualty counts as well of any unit during the war. So I had to know more. This picture is of the unit there in, I think at basic training, but they were quite amazing. So I really had to know more. Well, my newspaper experience caused me to really wish that I could personally interview one of these soldiers. Wouldn't that be great if I could? All this time I've been specifically studying about a battle that happened in France in October 1944, where a group of U.S. soldiers got trapped for almost a week in a dark forest there in France and were finally rescued by the 100th 442nd. It is referred to as the rescue of the Lost Battalion. And this is a picture of some of those soldiers from rescuing the Lost Battalion. So I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great to talk to someone who had actually been there? And I just very casually mentioned that to a friend of mine there in Spearfish, and she said, well, I think that maybe Kenny Higashi would be someone he might know something about that. And I couldn't believe it, that right here in my town, a World War II veteran of Japanese ancestry lived just a few miles from me. He was 94 years old, and I couldn't wait to meet him and find out if he was actually a member of this Lost Battalion. So my friend planned a visit to the Higashi home for us, and here is a picture of me and Kenny. And as we came, I think he and his wife kind of greeted me with a little amusement, because here I was, a stranger, really eager to ask him about his experiences from 75 years before. But he very graciously sat down with me, and that was the first of many times. So the first thing I wanted to know is, how did he come to live in South Dakota? And it turns out that he was born and raised right there in the Black Hills, the son of immigrants. Kenny was a Nisei, a first-generation Japanese American. So as we know, during the early 20th century, a lot of immigrants came to the United States, and most of the Japanese immigrants made it to the islands of Hawaii and also on the West Coast. But there was one Japanese immigrant and his brother with a lot of farming experience that decided to look inland. They spent a little time in Nebraska, probably following the sugar beet harvest, and then he and his brother ended up coming through the Black Hills into Spearfish, and this is what it looked like there about the turn of the century. The Black Hills at this time were home to a lot of immigrants from Northern Europe and gold seekers as far as South Africa, up there in Deadwood. The small towns there were down in the valley. Spearfish and Belfouche were providing food for the mines there in Lead and Deadwood, and these two brothers saw the wide open land and the horizons, and this is just what they thought would be great. So they went back. One of them went back to Japan, and he married his childhood sweetheart, and brought her to the Black Hills. And they started a family, and they had their family there and had a small farm there, and their last name was Higashi. So Kenneth Ray Higashi was born in 1921, and he grew up just like every other South Dakota boy at the time, pretty much. He had one older brother, he had 3 younger sisters, and his cousins and aunt and uncle lived in the next town over. And he had a long chore list at home and loved baseball and learned to fish and shoot small game, and everyone in town knew his family and respected them, and it was a reciprocal relationship. The Higashis were known for their kindness and their generosity to everyone there. And the town was supportive of that family from the very beginning, even when Mr. Higashi passed away in 1940. Kenny had many friends who would literally be his friends for life. This is a picture of him in his graduating class at Spearfish High School in 1941. I believe the theme of this celebratory dinner was Under the Sea. And, he just, at that point, tried to figure out what he would like to do with his life. This is his yearbook entry, and it says that he played basketball. So he had a lifelong love of sports. But then on December 7th, 1941, life changed for everyone in the United States, as we know. The ships there, filled with the sleeping young sailors, just burned uncontrollably and in a dramatic and horrifying way. And many saw someone to blame, many in America. And some people decided that their Japanese American neighbors, even though they knew these people and they were industrious and generous contributors to their communities, they were going to be the guilty ones. And as President Roosevelt tasked Americans with this new global peacekeeping mission that he had, he and government officials, they realized quickly the unrest that was growing within the communities, especially on the West Coast. There was a lot of rumor of spy activity among Japanese communities that swept through the mainstream media. And people believed those stories. Not all the neighbors of the Japanese Americans responded like my mother-in-law's grandparents with kindness and because they loved them. So the government decided to do the unthinkable. This is a picture of a grocery in Oakland, California. This was owned by a Japanese American who was born and raised right there in Oakland and even went to the university there and owned this shop, and he was forced to sell it, and he felt compelled to put this sign, "I am an American," in the window just in case anyone wasn't sure. So the unthinkable event that the government decided was the best thing to do is all Japanese Americans would be forced to leave their homes and their businesses, just abandon them, and incarcerated them in camps away from the coast, which these camps had been set up to detain these tens of thousands of innocent people displaced by this order, and there were no exceptions. This is a child and a mother they basically could only take whatever they could carry. So at this point, I was wondering if Kenny had experienced this suspicion and whether he was going to have to go, his family. They would be exempt, but I asked him to confirm, and he told me an amazing story I could never have imagined. He said that he had come home from work one day in February 1942, and this picture is of his brother that is in there. He's standing with another gentleman in their field. You can see how successful they were at farming. So in February 1942, Kenny came home, and he found two men in uniform at his home. They confiscated the family's radio, probably thinking maybe it was some sort of security measure in case they were going to do a two-way secret communication with Imperial Japan, which was ridiculous. And then they took the family shotgun, probably in case they wanted to hurt anyone, I don't know, in town, which was also ridiculous. And then they made a proposition to Kenny and his brother. One brother could stay with the mother and the sisters and run the farm, growing food for South Dakota families and keeping things going. But one brother would need to enlist in the military. Otherwise, the family would be sent to the camps. So they had to make a very quick decision. One brother was leaving home. And now I had a question about this because after Pearl Harbor, there were a lot of young American men and some young women who were across the country who wanted to enlist right away and join this global fight for freedom. This was no different for the Americans of Japanese ancestry. They also lined up to enlist right along with everyone else, but I was disturbed to discover that even though these young men, this is a group in Honolulu, I was extremely disturbed to discover they were turned away for service. They were even classified as 4C enemy alien, even those who were natural-born American citizens. So how was it that the Higashis would receive the opportunity to fight for the country and and I'm not exactly sure. I did read some newspaper articles that discussed the opportunity that the South Dakota legislature had been given by the federal government to set up an internment camp in South Dakota, and they declined the federal government's offer because they said they didn't feel like South Dakotans would be in support of that. But there also was some discussion of maybe some security measures being taken because of the mine up in Lead, with some military and non-military activity possibly. So I wasn't 100% sure. There were a few Japanese Americans from this East Riverside who were considered suspicious due to teaching or scientific jobs, and they were sent to camps as well. So I don't know for sure, but what I do know is that the people in town, when I talked to them, and they were unrelated to one another except for growing up in Spearfish, which this is downtown Spearfish at the top of the hill there, they told me the same thing. They, the townspeople, would not let anyone take their beloved neighbor family, the Higashis, away. They would stand in the way and not allow that to happen. No one knew who that was going to be, but they were very clear and confident that it was not going to happen. So I think the events that we've just talked about changes the narrative of our country a bit. So I understand this part of the country was not in the hot zone, so to speak, but I believe that this attitude of support for the Higashis showed a very common American attitude that hard work and mutual respect produces loyalty and devotion regardless of background or heritage or skin color. Over the years, I asked Kenny several times if he ever felt different than any of his peers in Spearfish. Here he is with his older brother, Clarence, and a friend in the middle there. He always answered me with, no, he never felt any different. So the only time he ever thought about being of Japanese ancestry was one time when his dad traveled to Japan to visit his own father, and Kenny just wanted to play baseball with the guys after school, and all they wanted to do was ask him questions. How long is your dad going to be gone? What kind of boat will he take? Will he bring us back any souvenirs? What's Japan like? And Kenny didn't really know or really care. He just wanted to play baseball. Here he is with his friend, Buster Vopat. So back to the decision then the family would have to make who would go. Clarence was a mechanic in town. He was gifted with a natural ability to fix cars and had an interest in machines. So Kenny decided that Clarence possessed more skills valuable to the well-being of their family farm, and Clarence should stay and Kenny would go. So the men in uniform signed him right then into the Army before they left, and he got on an eastbound train the very next morning. So how did this sudden departure make him feel? I wondered. He'd never left the Black Hills before. Now he was venturing into the unknown, possibly into a prejudicial environment or a deadly situation. What was he thinking about? And he said nothing special. He knew it was the right thing to do. The details would work themselves out, and it was just a very practical, kind of common sense approach. Regarding his military career, I was interested to know, so I began constructing a timeline of his movements. He was sent to Fort Benning for his basic training, but it didn't last long because in June of that year, 1942, the Army moved him to Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, and he had joined a group of all Japanese American volunteers fresh from Hawaii. They finally were allowed, after petitioning the president several times, they were finally allowed to enlist, and they were assigned to their own unit, the 100th Battalion, and Kenny was assigned to Rifle Company C. All of these young men from Hawaii had been part of the Hawaiian Provisional Battalion, which had been formed with the National and Territorial Guard members, and some of them had been eyewitnesses of what had gone on there at Pearl Harbor. And they arrived stateside bringing strong patriotic determination to prove their loyalty. So here's a picture of Kenny there, I think at basic. They arrived with also their island customs of their pidgin slang and their music, and they also, he told me, taught him how to play a really good game of poker. All of them had Japanese immigrant parents. just like Kenny, but that's really where most of the similarities ended. He was kind of different to them. He said he felt a little different being a Midwesterner through and through. But as the unit trained together, I also wondered what he thought of their fascination with things like snow, which was pretty common. This is a picture of something that they took there. It says Meleki Likimaka, Merry Christmas, and Company C, 100th Infantry Battalion, Makahiki Hau, which means Happy New Year. So, but over those months, Kenny and his new military buddies actually completed basic training a few times in Camp McCoy and then in Camp Shelby, Mississippi. And in May 1943, they were joined by around 4,500 volunteers, more volunteers from Hawaii and some from the mainland. Now, these mainland volunteers had left their families, their dads, their moms, their sisters, brothers, wives and children behind barbed wire in the garden camps around the country. And they came with the same determination to prove their loyalty to a country which had largely rejected them. With the arrival of these new troops, the unit was consolidated and renamed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The 100th remained separate. It was a special dispensation. It wasn't really common, but they still remained separate because they had been the first ones together, and the 100th ended up being shipped out that September to Europe. So, of course, I had to ask Kenny, this is a picture of some of the guys with their practicing their poker skills. I had to ask Kenny about his wartime experiences. He really hadn't talked much about that, and a lot of the veterans really had not talked much about that, which is understandable. But with a lot of assistance from some historians and archives, I began to understand how terrible and agonizing this service really was. And I began to also realize that my new friend, Kenny Higashi, was a hero and part of something very special in our American story. As far as I can tell, and all of my research that I've done, Kenny Higashi is the only veteran in the 100th 442nd who was born in South Dakota and made South Dakota his home. So that's very special. The account of them is very important. Their service, telling how they sacrificed themselves with an unwavering attitude of love for this country. And so as we honor Kenny and this unit, I'm a former teacher, so I think this way about how we can figure out how to remember these things. And so I thought that we could remember it with the letter V, and V stands for 5 things that they exemplified. So the first one would be values. These soldiers had a reputation for being dependable, efficient, effective. They used their common sense, their brotherhood, and their determination to do the job that they had to do without really considering the risk or the accolades. They worked together and to accomplish each mission with true patriotism for the United States and her people. The memories Kenny shared with me at this time didn't really focus on that shocking kind of aspect of his experience. His recollections were more centered on things that probably had to do with his upbringing, and it was mostly about the food. He told me this is a picture of a farmhouse there in France where they were passing by. But Kenny told me one time that they passed a farmhouse similar to this one, probably a lot smaller, but it was empty of all its occupants except the chickens. So he and his friends did what was very practical and chased all the chickens down and then ate them. He didn't mention that the unmentioned, which is that someone had fled their life's work, their farm, because of German occupation and the threat of death. But once in the Alps, Kenny said he and the others were hungry for something other than sea rations. I don't know if you've heard about sea rations. They are described to be the worst in the Army. And so he told me that he reached into an icy stream up there in the Alps. It was one of those really probably beautiful things, and wiggled his fingers under the bank and caught fish this way. And he said after 72 years, he could remember they were trout, and he caught 25 of them. So now, I don't know, is that a fish story? I'm not sure, but so his descriptions of most of his service were really basic in his mind. He had a job to do, and he did it. It's just that humble, equal, attitude of equality. For example, I asked him how he earned the rank of sergeant. He told me that it was because he had fortified his foxholes with sod that he cut and laid. And those kept them from eroding and flooding, and that was something his dad had taught him how to do, and he did say it was easier to cut than South Dakota prairie. So, but his friends asked if they would teach him, and he did, and this is a foxhole there in the mountains in France, a picture of that. But this combination of humility and leadership evidently caught the attention of his superiors, taking that common farm technique and just being practical with it and teaching others. The next thing we can remember is their virtues. From 1943 to 1945, these men suffered a high casualty rate for their consistent commitment to combat, but each time their numbers went down, they were quickly replaced by more volunteers of Japanese ancestry. Again, these men leaving their families behind barbed wire, far away from their homes and businesses, and each of them equally blended their devotion and love for the country with a great desire to honor their parents and their heritage, which is a wonderful example for all of us today. So quickly, I will go through these. Valor is another one. Obviously, no one disputes this trait. They lived up to their motto, which was, their unit motto was "Go for broke," which is a gambling term for betting it all or nothing. Kenny's service record, his personal service record, is quite unique to other World War II units, even his other fellow 442nd brothers, because in September of 1942, he entered duty, 43, I think it's 43. He entered in Oran, North Africa, and served in Italy and France, and he served in several prominent battles that are significant for being some of the most effective and valiant of the entire conflict. And he didn't even remember all the medals he received because there were so many. And he stopped active duty only when he was wounded in combat. And this was a particular battle that happened on April 5th, 1945. The Nazis had occupied this particular mountain fortress there in the northern Italian Alps, and for 5 months the Allies had tried to pursue taking this, and they were not able to do it. And the 100th 442nd worked on a strategy and were able to accomplish and take the stronghold in 32 minutes. So what the Allied troops had tried to do in 5 months, they did in 32 minutes. And of course, you can imagine the astounding loss of life and injury. And that's when Kenny took 2 bullets through the knees, both knees. He went down. He said he did not want to bother the medics, so he crawled back to camp. I think it was a little bit less than a mile. So he received the Purple Heart for his work that day. And the last one that I have, the second to last, is vision. They just kept the focus on what they had to do. Despite leaving their families behind barbed wire, they focused their actions on their 3 years of sustained service. And as a collective, they were focused and resolved to do what they had to do. This is a picture of them in the beautiful mountains there, but taking Nazi prisoners of war. So they were just relentless with their vision. They were very focused. And finally, their victories. The 100th 442nd Service record is one of the most decorated, as I have said before. But I think their special emphasis that's often overlooked about them is that they believed it was up to them to preserve opportunity for all Americans to experience full freedom. They saw the good in the ideal of the American way and focused on that rather than the mistakes and wrong choices that some people had made. And they believed that the color of one's skin should never determine the level of freedom and potential of that person. And so they left us a legacy of real strength that was filled with hope. So this is a victory for us all. And Kenny was part of that from the beginning. I asked him one more question, big one. Was he part of that lost battalion that I had spent all this time researching? And he said that he was. This is what some of the conditions were like there. I couldn't believe it when he could describe for me how it felt, what the weather was like, and he had some very detailed descriptions that were really important for me to be able to know. I had seen photographs, but I had no idea about some of the things that he went through. And he earned the Bronze Star Medal for his actions that day. On his citation, it says, quote, "Sergeant Higashi's dauntless efforts and unwavering courage are traits to emulate." So after learning all of this, I felt really strongly about preserving the legacy of the 100th 442nd for all Americans, especially children. One organization that is set up to do this is the Go for Broke National Education Center in Los Angeles. They have a monument there that my family and I were pleased to visit in downtown Los Angeles. It displays all the names of the soldiers, not just the ones who didn't make it home, but the heroes who did make it home. So I was honored to find Kenny's name there on the monument. And he was surprised that he was there, but I said, "Why wouldn't you be there?" So young readers in our country really need to understand this, because if they're not aware of the heavy price that has been paid for the freedoms they enjoy, they will easily give them up at some point and not treasure the gift of being an American. And the gentleman that was responsible for setting this monument up, he took a lot of the work. Colonel Young Ok Kim, he was amazing leader of Company B, so not Kenny's company, but Kenny did tell me very often and with excitement and pride that he had seen Colonel Kim fighting in battle, so he was pretty pleased about that. But Colonel Kim said that this was really important monument to set up because it was really an American story, and he wanted Americans to understand that these individual Americans made America a stronger country and a better country. So it's a true American story. He insisted on that, and he felt that children should understand their story is not just in the past, but that they can learn lessons from these soldiers that will make their life better. So I decided to pursue writing this down, and I did publish a book in 2019. Actually, the Go for Broke National Education Center chose to print my family's story, The Plum Neighbor. And then I felt Kenny's story from hometown to battlefield and back was too remarkable to keep to myself. So I am very pleased that South Dakota Historical Society Press agreed with me and published A Place for Harvest. And the artist, Felicia Hoshino, created amazing and beautiful art to tell the story, and I would like to invite her up to tell you more about that.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Lauren. I'll be forever grateful for that casual conversation where Kenny Higashi's name came up, and as a result, A Place for Harvest was born, and it sounded like a very special encounter, and I'm really glad that I could be part of this project. And I definitely need to thank the South Dakota Historical Society Press for bringing me here today to Pier, and yeah, thank you so much for welcoming me. So, as an illustrator, one of my favorite parts, besides the drawing and the painting, is that I get to delve into the lives of the characters in the story, whether it's fictional or non-fictional. So I've been really honored that I've gotten to get to know Kenny and his life story through Lauren's words. This is my first time in South Dakota, so I was not born and raised here as Kenny was. However, we do share a history. In the story, Lauren talks about Mr. and Mrs. Higashi immigrating to this country from Japan and falling in love with the South Dakota landscape and wanting to settle here and becoming farmers. And so, similarly, My great-grandfather, Konoichi, and my great-grandmother, Toshi Takahashi, also came here from Japan, and they settled in Southern California. And they worked really hard and cultivated the land as well, specializing in lima beans. And they were very prosperous. And this is, so my grandmother, Chizuko Arikawa, she was born in 1917. And just a little bit after she was born, the family decided to move back to Japan. And from what I understand, my great-grandfather, Konoichi, he got very frustrated with what was happening in California as far as ownership of farmland. So the California Alien Land Law of 1913, and also the same law of 1920, these were laws put in place to prohibit ownership of land to aliens ineligible for citizenship, so the immigrants, and it applied to all or many different immigrants, but the Japanese American immigrants, I feel, were targeted. And so this really frustrated my great-grandfather. Eventually, he did return to Japan and settle in Central California and started again. And I think they moved around a few times. Every time the lease, their lease was up as tenant farmers, the landowners would take over the land. But yeah, my grandmother's family continued to live in California, and she got married to my grandfather, Minoru Arikawa, in 1936. Started to raise a family. And then you'll find in A Place for Harvest in the story, when Pearl Harbor was bombed and the Executive Order 9066 was put in place. And while here in Spearfish, or where Kenny lived, the Spearfish community were willing to stick up for the family, and they weren't going to allow the family to be taken away. The climate was very different in California, as you can imagine. And so my father, this particular photo was actually taken towards the end of my family. My grandmother, Chizuko, and their family were at Poston, Arizona camp. So this is actually in 1945. And my father is 3 years old in this picture, but he was just 2 months old when they were first put on the train and taken to an undetermined destination in the camp. So he spent the first 3 years of his life behind barbed wire. And he doesn't have any clear memories of the camps, but he does remember feeling the stress. And similar to Kenny, these are my grandmother's brothers, 2 of them, Shigeru Takahashi and Toshio Takahashi, and they volunteered to serve in the Army. And these are photos, again, taken in Poston, Arizona camps as they were visiting their families who were incarcerated there. And I don't know too much about their story, but I've been inspired to find out, and I know Lauren has all the resources, and so I will definitely, look into finding out their experience as well. So again, my father, 3 years old, and growing up, he always said, don't ask Grandma and Grandpa about their experience. It's really just too painful. They don't want to revisit it. So I stayed quiet, and I didn't really ask any questions. However, my cousin Cheryl, she was a few years older than me, and she decided she was going to sit my grandmother down and interview her for a paper she was writing while she was at UC Berkeley. And so the story is about the lima beans and going back to Japan and coming, in the California alien land laws. I learned from her paper. And it was her who wasn't afraid to ask the questions like Lauren did of Kenny. And I just wanted to share some other books. This is A Place for Where Sunflowers Grow, written by Amy Lee Tai. And again, I'm so grateful for these writers who aren't afraid to ask the questions. And she wanted to write a story about her grandmother, Hisako Hibi, who was an artist. And she was responsible for starting art schools in the Topaz camp. So they were able to bring in art material for the children and adults too. And so this is what A Place Where Sunflowers Grows is about. And this is another story that I illustrated, My Dog Tenny. And in his own words, Yoshito Wayne Osaki wrote about his experience of having to abandon his dog before being forced to move from their homes. And so we wrote a children's book, or I illustrated a children's book for him. And then it brings me to A Place for Harvest. So now, we'll talk about the illustration process. There are about 5 steps here, going from the manuscript, then to thumbnail sketches, which are very, very small, as big as my thumb. I keep them nice and small. And then I go back to research and gather reference materials, and then final sketches, and then the final artwork. So when I first get Lauren's story, it's just her words on a blank page. And as I'm reading the story, I'm trying to grab different things that pop out at me and stand out. So it says that Kenny, he smiled often and always offered a helping hand. So that told me kind of a lot about who Kenny was. And then she talks about when Mr. Higashi sees the wide prairies filled with waving grasses dotted with wildflowers, so that feels like a nice image to include. And then it talks about him marrying his childhood sweetheart, and then having a family with Brother Clarence and their 3 sisters. And so I was trying to think of how can I incorporate all these different elements into one image. Oops, we'll go back. Okay, and so I came up with this image of a picnic scene. It's a very rough sketch. This is the thumbnail sketch I was telling you about. It's about maybe this big. It's very small, and but it's just to give the publisher an idea of what I have in mind. And then once this is approved, I go back in to get the actual reference material. So we have the, Lookout Mountain, and then also just what kind of clothing they might wear and how they might sit at a picnic. Sorry, my finger. And then I do a final sketch here, so you can see that's a lot more detail, and I present that to the publisher. And then I move on to the final artwork, and I work in primarily watercolor and watercolor pencils. And additionally, because of my Japanese background, I wanted to include some cultural references. I figured as immigrants, as much as you try to immerse yourself in the community, there are things that you carry with you and you keep. So I wanted to think of what they might have at their picnic. So some onigiri or rice balls might be served. And then the jimbei is a cotton yukata that a child might wear. And then I was told that Mrs. Higashi would pickle vegetables in her basement, and it's called a nukazuke style of fermenting. And so I knew I had to put that somewhere in the story, so this is in one of the opening pages. And then I also included some chawan, or rice bowls, and hashi, chopsticks. I have them in the kitchen scene. You'll see, you could spot them on the shelf. And then just more reference that I was grateful to receive from the Historical Society, as well as directly from the Higashi family, a picture of the home, the interior of the kitchen, and then the cabbage fields that Lauren had mentioned, and then the Queen City Mail newspaper headline, so I can kind of see, make sure that I reference that when there's a gentleman in the story that's reading a newspaper, so I wanted to have that. So I was grateful that they helped me find those things. So there's the family photos. And these are personal photos of Kenny's like siblings, and even though the three sisters are not mentioned specifically in the story, I definitely got this sense of closeness, and so I wanted to make sure they were, shown, and you'll see them on the farm or, doing different activities. And then this walking tour of Spearfish was super helpful for me. So I could see the details of some of these buildings that are still standing. For instance, this is the lone mercantile store where Kenny worked. And so this was a really great resource. And it really helped me in the street scene towards the end of the book when Kenny returns home. And again, this is a thumbnail, so very loose. And then we have more kind of tighter a sketch. And then the final artwork. And then one thing I quickly will point out is in the bottom right corner, you'll see a mailman. And I wanted to include, again, it wasn't mentioned in the story, but I wanted to include that when Kenny returned from the war, he worked for the Spearfish post office. So this was just a little nod to his years, many years of service there. Again, I'm really grateful to the writers. I'm an illustrator primarily, so I don't write this story, so I'm so grateful for the writers like Lauren, like Amy, and like Mr. Osaki for bringing their stories forward and then allowing me to bring them to life through my illustrations. So as I mentioned, or I should say, 2022 marks the 80th anniversary of the Executive Order 9066. And my father was also born in 1942. So he celebrated his 80th birthday. And my last image I will share with you, after the war, or after they were released from Poston, Arizona camp, they did not return back to their farmlands in Central California. They found another opportunity in San Francisco's Japantown. And so this is a photograph of my father coming home from fishing with his father, my grandfather Minoru. And so it's these images that I come across that may inspire me to someday write stories. And so anyway, I just wanted to share that with you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Just as we close here, I wanted to just add a couple more things. In 2019, through the assistance of a veteran from Hawaii whose uncle was in Kenny's unit, we applied and Kenny was accepted for the French Medal of Honor. And here he is receiving that. Actually, this is when he was also presented with and pinned with his medals from the U.S. Army. So they sent someone to, but the French Consulate General traveled from Chicago to present Kenny with his medal for his service to the French people some 75 years before. And then Kenny also had earned multiple medals, including his Bronze Star and Purple Heart. And I asked Kenny what he thought about all of these medals that were all over his jacket, and he confidently told me that they must belong to someone else. They couldn't be his. This simple, practical view of his part in preserving freedom is consistent with what he shared with me many times. He viewed his wartime contribution. Here he is with his wife on the stage. He just had a job to do, and he did the best that he could. And he told me that the real heroes were the ones that didn't make it home. The day of his ceremony, the French consulate general said, there is the medal that they gave him, said, quote, "A debt that France owes America's greatest generation for their service in World War II is a debt that the French people will never be able to repay in full. The French people will never, ever forget the sacrifice." And I personally take that seriously, and I see it as a challenge for all of us. We as Americans all owe a debt that we can never repay in full. Many of these soldiers are gone, and we no longer have the chance to thank them. If we don't remember, and if we don't honor, and we don't retell and recount their own personal stories, then who will? After meeting with him, Kenny gave me a very special treasure. There we are. And what he gave me was the patch from his service uniform. It's the unit patch for the 100th 442nd. It's the arm of Lady Liberty holding up the torch of freedom inside a casket. And I cherish this patch because it reminds me of him and that he told me all about his selfless service. And I'm grateful that we all have this book now so that all of us can remember him and his friends in the Purple Heart Battalion, and that we can share their legacy to the next generations of South Dakotans and Americans. And I appreciate that you allowed me to come talk about him today. Does anyone have any questions? I think.
Yep. We have time for a couple brief questions.
Most of us here were born between 1941 and 1953. How many of us have had the privilege of knowing someone who was incarcerated in one of the camps that the Americans put the Japanese in? Even those with memories like that are getting few and far between.
All right, well, thank you, Lauren and Felicia, for coming. We have time for a quick break, and then we're coming back for our last session of the day before the reception.
Thank you.